Salmond joins me to take your calls, but a little later in the programme, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Believe me, you'll want to listen to this. Leaked documents show how many powers US corporations are going to be granted under Ttip. I think it's a complete affront to democracy. I cannot for the life of me understand why Britain or the EU wants anything to do with it. I think that all countries in the EU should have a referendum on Ttip. What do you think? That's coming up after 6 here on LBC. If you would like to watch us live, lbc.co.uk is where you need to go. The reason is Alex Salmond, SNP Foreign Affairs spokesman, is with me in the studio. Alex, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Now, PMQs today, I was watching it earlier. I mean, pretty vicious stuff.
Yeah, it's all this, whataboutism, who's more racist than thou, and, accusations going back and forth across the dispatch box. I mean, I know it's the day before elections, right? So you've got to take that into account. But you might actually hope that things like racism or anti-Semitism are so important that, leaders of democratic parties might just agree that they actually do lead democratic parties, and their job is to unite against these things, as opposed to use them as election badinage.
I mean, David Cameron looked genuinely angry. Do you think he was genuinely angry, or was it a bit of a ham actor performance?
No, I think it's the flash man coming out, isn't it? I mean, I'm very troubled. I mean, look, I do make allowances for Prime Minister's questions or First Minister's questions. I mean, I've been part of it, and things are often said, sometimes in the heat of the moment, of course. But I'm really actually quite concerned about this whole business of the Imam. That this is Imam Suleiman Ghani. Now, I know that LBC have done a lot of work in this, but if you remember last week's Prime Minister's questions, David Cameron says, look, your candidate for mayor has been, Sadiq Khan, has been associating 7 times with this dreadful Imam who's been saying dreadful things supporting Islamic State. Now, what's turned out, of course, is that this same Imam has been invited to Tory meetings, been pictured with Zach Goldsmith, and now the number 10 are saying, well, he wasn't actually supporting Islamic State, it was for an Islamic State. So either this Imam, who I don't know actually, and I have no great knowledge of, either he's a dreadful extremist, in which case why is he being invited to Conservative Party meetings, or alternatively, he's being misrepresented by the Prime Minister, in which case why is he being used as an instrument for smearing other democratic politicians? Now, you call me old-fashioned, but I really don't think the Prime Minister should be lowering himself or demeaning his office to flinging this sort of Linton Crosby stuff across the chamber. It's nonsense.
It was weird because it was as if the intervening week hadn't happened and that David Cameron hadn't seen all of the stories that we've carried on LBC about the fact that Mr Ghani had attended Conservative Party functions. It was as if that hadn't happened. And what about the whole interaction between Jeremy Corbyn and David Cameron on the anti-Semitism row? I mean, Jeremy Corbyn kept trying to ask questions on election issues, but every time David Cameron came back, it was on Suleiman Ghani or anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and I mean, you've got to be fair about it. I mean, I don't think even his best friend, John McDonnell, would actually say that Jeremy Corbyn's handled all this particularly well in terms of his speed of response and a range of other things. But, at the end of the day, having known Jeremy Corbyn for 30 years, I don't believe he's an extremist, and I don't believe that he would tolerate or wish to tolerate racism or anti-Semitism within the Labour Party.
Do you think I mean, we may come on to that a little bit later, but do you think that the Prime Minister should apologise for these references to Suleiman Ghani, particularly on the IS thing? I mean, he was doing it under parliamentary privilege, so I suppose he doesn't need to.
Well, yes, I do. I mean, because either he sticks by the impression he's been given that this is a dreadful person who's preaching hate and doing all sorts of dreadful things, in which case he has to answer why is the Conservative Party being associated with him, trying to be in these candidates for local government and things like this, inviting him along to conferences. Or alternative, which is even more serious, that this man, who may have views that we disagree with, but nonetheless hasn't done or said the things that the Prime Minister was giving the impression, in which case he's just a citizen who's being used as some sort of weapon or instrument to attack
So
the
he's
opposition.
being smeared by the PM, effectively.
Yeah, and I actually think that UK citizens shouldn't actually be smeared by their Prime Minister. And if he has been, and that seems to be the new Downing Street defence, he wasn't actually doing what the Prime Minister implied he was doing, in which case the gentleman is due an apology.
Right, let's go to your
I don't know
calls.
what Prime Minister apologies like, actually. Whether you get a letter or whether he says it in the
Well,
dispatch box.
you must have apologised in your time as First Minister.
Yeah, only rarely, but I didn't go around smearing Scottish citizens. I really didn't.
No, just English ones.
Not even in the Labour, not even English ones. As the greatest Anglophile in Scottish politics, as you're well aware, Ian Dale, I never had to do that. But occasionally I corrected the record and apologised to the Scottish Parliament if I got a figure wrong, something like that. But I honestly didn't go about smearing people.
I think generally it doesn't do a politician any harm to say, look, I got it wrong, I'm sorry. I do it often enough on this programme. I'm still here.
None whatsoever. I mean, I remember the very, very effective demonstration of that was Nicola Sturgeon had a position with one of her constituents, and she in good faith represented somebody who turned out to be not as they had presented themselves. And she was under quite a bit of pressure on it, and then she made a fully comprehensive, detailed policy at the Scottish Parliament, which incidentally did her reputation no end of good.
Let's go to your calls. 0345 6060973. If you'd like to ask Alex a question, he's here until 4:30. You can watch us live on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk. Dave is in Forest Hill. Hello, Dave.
Thanks for taking my call, Mr. Salmond. It's an honor to speak with you. I've got a question about a good friend of yours. As you know, Mr. Trump all but locked up the Republican nomination yesterday. And as disturbing as that is for many of us, I guess my question for you is, as a minister, as an elected leader here in both in Scotland and the UK, theoretically it's possible he could be elected president.
Yeah, the nightmare gets worse and worse.
If that were to happen, how would you adjust to that? I know most Americans would move to Canada, but how would you adjust, and what recommendations would you have for your colleagues in Westminster? How do you adjust to what would be a new normal?
Well, I think you'd be making a great mistake thinking you'd be safe in Canada. I mean, it just sounds like the sort of liberal, progressive state that Donald would want to be aggressive towards. I would have thought so. Canada, I don't think, would supply a safe haven. I mean, previously, Dave, I've discussed with Ian that the South Pole might be a good refuge point for us all. But listen, I'm hoping he doesn't win the presidency, doesn't win the general election, and when it comes to the eminent good sense of the generality of citizens of the Republic, they'll go on the basis of ABD, which is anybody but Donald.
But do you think that it would be in the best interests of the United Kingdom for David Cameron maybe to apologise for the remarks that he made in December when he called him, I think, idiotic and divisive? One of Donald Trump's advisers has said he should do that.
No, in this case, I think it would do David Cameron the world of good not to apologise. I think David should concentrate on apologising to UK citizens that he might have smeared and leave his remarks about Donald Trump to stand on the record.
But if Donald Trump becomes President of the United States, if he has a derogatory view of David Cameron and indeed this country, that's not actually going to assist anything, is it? Surely you need to start off on an even keel.
Well, there is no doubt. I mean, let's just consider the awful prospect that the other Dave, our callers, brought forward, that Donald might actually get his finger in the nuclear button and his bottom onto the seat in the Oval Office. In these circumstances, then he does become the president, and Mr. Cameron or whoever else would have to deal with him on that basis. But up until that point, I think he should let his correct assessment of Donald Trump stand on the record.
What would your advice be to David Cameron, Dave?
Well, I think that he needs to... I'd like to hear from him how he feels that the candidacy of Donald Trump has it damaged the special relationship. Obviously, the things he says, the things he does, you're dealing with someone who doesn't operate by norms, and so my advice to David Cameron is expect the unexpected. But, Mr. Salmond, I'd be interested to ask you that as well, if you feel that the candidacy of Mr. Trump, having come this far, has that done damage to the relationship between the United States and the UK?
No, I think it's done damage to America's reputation. I mean, most people, whatever they say and whatever complaints they have about American foreign policy and whichever complaints they have about individual presidents, people have had an abiding respect for the Republic. I mean, people actually admire many, many aspects of America. And I think the idea that somebody like the Donald could assume the highest office in the free world actually does damage to America. And therefore, hopefully, America will redeem its reputation, and particularly my appeal to Scots Americans is just remember that man would let down America just as he's let down Scotland.
There is a chance, though, now that he will be president. If you look at the polls, they are moving in his direction.
27%, according to the assessment of the polls this morning.
No, you put him up against Hillary. And he's gradually moving ahead.
I'm merely saying what the Betfair analysis this morning, his chances of becoming president, as of this morning, were 27%, creeping up.
So you don't look as if you're losing sleep.
No, this is one of the things, actually. There are very, very few things in politics in life which make me lose sleep. Actually, Donald in the White House would be one of them.
Why do you think Hillary Clinton is so unpopular?
I don't know. I mean, you know how they talk about Teflon candidates, like perhaps Bill Clinton was a Teflon candidate. You know,
yourself?
Well, perhaps myself, but perhaps others. That basically nothing really ever stuck to them on the basis that the public had some affection for them and therefore were prepared to forgive them a great deal. And perhaps that applies to me. It certainly applies to a number of politicians. Hillary's the opposite. She's the kind of Velcro candidate that everything sticks to her. Everything. And things that wouldn't have been really damaging for other politicians, a bit like the emails, for example. Yes, it might have been embarrassing, but it wouldn't have been really damaging. Seemed to damage Hillary more than they damage other politicians.
Right.
Now, it could be a reason. She's been around a long time in politics. Perhaps you acquire that unfortunate tendency. But whatever reason, she is vulnerable in that sense.
Let's go to another call. Dave, thank you very much for your call. Joe is in Stourbridge. Hello, Joe.
Hi.
Hi. What's your question?
Oh, well, good afternoon, everyone. I would just like to ask Mr. Salmond how he squares this humanitarian act of taking lone children into Europe or into the United Kingdom with the undoubted pull factor that it will have for countless thousands who would like to follow.
Well, I don't accept the pull factor. I don't accept it generally in terms of the refugee crisis in Europe, but I certainly don't accept it as far as unaccompanied children are concerned, Joe. And I think the idea that parents are going to stick unaccompanied children in boats to go across the Mediterranean and risking death, I think that's a bit far-fetched. I don't think there's any evidence for it. But Mr. Cameron is now well in the way, screeching towards a U-turn on this issue. And after listening to Prime Minister's questions today, I confidently predict that we're not actually going to have a vote next Monday, because I think the Prime Minister is pulling stumps and following the advice of Angus Robertson, the SNP, the leaders of the Kinder Children from the 1930s, even the Daily Mail, as well as Ian Dale, and asking for the humanitarian gesture to be made, that they, suffer the little children to come and
All right, Joe, back to you.
Yes, I think that would be an admirable and compassionate, and no one with any heart could say that, we don't feel for these young people. However, I would first of all say that I think the definition of calling them children very often is an emotive label. They're very often 14, 15, 16, 17-year-old, predominantly young men. And actually, we aren't talking about little toddlers wandering around.
Joe, that is a really interesting point, because figures I've got here show that only 6% of these children are under the age of 14. These figures are from 2014, it has to be said, but 62% aged 16 and 17. Now, technically, yeah, they're children, but an 8-year-old is rather different from an unaccompanied 16 or 17-year-old, isn't it?
And the United Kingdom, if it makes a gesture, will have the right and ability to select the children that they believe are in greatest need and in greatest need of our help. But the idea, Joe, and I'm sure you wouldn't want to give this impression, that there aren't more than 3,000 children, and I mean children, who need our help, wouldn't be correct and wouldn't be accurate.
Joe, thank you very much indeed. Let's go to Niran, who's in Edgware. Hello, Niran.
Hello, hi, good afternoon. Thank you for taking my call. Mr. Simon, I just wanted to know, do you agree that people nowadays who are anti-Semites, they are using anti-Zionism and anti-Israel as a stage to avoid actually being accused of being anti-Semites?
I think that's possible, Ninan. I mean, it's... I think there's two things go on. I think undoubtedly there are a number of people on the progressive, the left side of politics, who have got so wound up, and in many cases very honestly and very emotionally, in the position of Palestine and what's happened to the Palestinian people and the actions of the Israeli government, that sometimes they conflate the actions of the Israeli government or indeed the Israeli state, or which it's perfectly legitimate to criticise, with the actions of Jewish people in general. And that's the conflation where a legitimate criticism of Israel can turn into anti-Semitic remarks. And it's very, very important that people are aware of this and don't allow it to happen, and nor do allow people to shelter under the general political banner. It's equally true, I think, Iran, that some people who are anxious to defend the actions of the Israeli government also conflate on the other side. Now, as we discussed previously on this programme, I mean, I speak as a board member of the Holocaust Memorial Commission. I wrote the foreword to the Scotland's Jews in 2008, the history of the Jewish people in Scotland over the last 1,000 years. I opened a photography exhibition a couple of years ago about the amazing contribution that Jewish people have made to Scotland over the years. So I don't think anybody serious is going to be accusing me of anti-Semitic tendencies. But I do have serious criticisms of the Israeli government, and I make absolute care when I'm voicing these criticisms not to conflate that with any suggestion of attacking Judaism as a religion, or indeed the Jewish people as a race.
Niran, thank you for that. Let's take a related question from Ron, who's in Greenwich. Ron, fire away.
Yes, hi. Hello, Alex.
Hello, Ron.
Do you think that David Cameron's demand or attempt to smear Jeremy Corbyn with a demand to distance himself from being friends with...
How is that a smear?
Well,
he either did appear on the platform and call them his friends, or he didn't.
Well, it's an attempt to... I feel it's a contempt... an attempt to project Jeremy Corbyn as some sort of terrorist apologist. Do you think that that's a legitimate sort of accusation, Alex?
No, I don't, Ron. And we touched on this a bit earlier on. I think this kind of flashman streak of Cameron. I mean, let's face it, Jeremy, who I've known for 30 years and liked for 30 years, is not lightning on his feet in these circumstances. When you're asked to distance yourself from Hamas, what you should do is, yes, I distance myself from Hamas. You should just...
And that's what you should have done
yes,
today.
Yes, of course. But, having said that, anybody who's known him for that period of time, I don't believe that Jeremy Corbyn is a terrorist sympathiser. I think occasionally through his political career he's taken positions which allow that to be interpreted. And I do believe, incidentally, this smear and smear-alike campaign of the Conservative Party, as we discussed earlier in the London mayoral elections, does them no credit whatsoever.
Well, that's very different from here. This is actually dealing with facts. Jeremy Corbyn did appear on a platform in the House of Commons. He invited them to this meeting, admittedly some time ago, and he called them his friends. Now, he must have known what Hamas and Hezbollah were like. It's entirely legitimate for an opposing politician to point that out.
Which is why, if Jeremy Corbyn was that bit quicker on his feet, he would just have said, no, I don't approve of terrorist tactics, I don't approve of the use of violence, and would have said that and cleared it out of the way. But just because Jeremy is not lightning on his feet doesn't make it reasonable, the whole range of Tory guilt by association targets that they have. I mean, just because Jeremy hasn't ordered the administration of the Labour Party in such a way to protect himself against that doesn't make the tactic in itself legitimate.
A lot of people will say that's further evidence that he's just making a complete mess of being Labour leader.
Well, I don't think...
On the day before there are local elections.
I don't think Jeremy's a natural leader of the Labour Party. I think his politics are in tune with the New Labour membership, but I don't necessarily think he spent his life developing the political skills that a leader needs, particularly one who is generally under assault by the bulk of the mainstream press, who'll only be too glad to amplify this.
But of course a lot of people in the Labour Party think this is a sort of Blairite media conspiracy against Jeremy Corbyn. All the anti-Semitism row, that's effectively what Ken Livingstone was saying.
Yes, well, and I drew a distinction between Naz Shah and Ken Livingstone.
I think we all
last
do.
week. Well, I think there was a genuine distinction. I mean, if a young member of Parliament makes a mistake a couple of years ago, makes a fulsome apology, and says that's not what I meant, I don't think their entire career should be blighted by that. I don't think that should be a burden that's carried forward. But Ken Livingstone is not a young politician. So he's been around, as longer than Adam.
So there's a way back for Naz Shah, but should there be a way back for Ken Livingstone?
No, I would have had Ken's out before his feet touched the ground, because you cannot make debating
so
points.
Expelled forever and ever.
Well, I think it was an expellable offence. I mean, look, he's not a novice in politics, and Ken, one way or another, had to know he was pouring petrol on the flames of a big problem for his leader.
We'll move on to another subject in a second, but you went to Iran recently in your capacity as SNP Foreign Affairs spokesman. Did you talk to the Iranian government about why they fund Hamas and Hezbollah?
Well, we talked at some length about terrorism, about approaches, and about how to develop a different attitude to international relations. And I'm hopeful that we can make a small contribution, along with many others, to bringing Iran back into the full fold of international relations. That doesn't
answer the question. Did you actually bring that subject up with them?
Absolutely, because one of the arguments that they would make, that unlike some other states, they're not engaged currently in the illegal bombing of a helpless people, as is happening at the present moment.
Well, they're funding Hamas in Gaza, who do throw rockets over into Israel, and they would describe themselves as helpless people. There would be a very fair argument that in the complex situation in the Middle East, both the Israeli state and indeed other organisations like Hamas are doing things that we consider unacceptable. So you're equating Israel to Hamas?
No, what I'm saying is this, that the job of politicians like myself is to try and make things better if we can, to try and establish relationships. And in the case of Iran at the present moment, Ian, to support the progressive forces which are becoming increasingly powerful in Iran, which can perhaps open the door to a new and better relationship. And trying to do something like that, Ian, is infinitely more important than debating points flung across the Commons chamber, trying to smear people with guilt by association.
You can, of course, watch us at lbc.co.uk. Let's go to Amjad, who's in Reading. Amjad, what would you like to ask?
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for taking my call. And I like Alex Salmond so much as a politician. He's a very
enough of that.
Don't listen to Ian, Amjad. Just you keep speaking. You're doing great.
What would you like to ask, Amjad?
I know, and I wish him to be a foreign secretary so he can put British policy in the right direction. And I want him to be prime
and your question
so
might be?
Really represent the country. He's so good politician, honestly.
Amjad is asking me whether I want to be foreign secretary or prime minister.
Get to your question, please.
Yeah, question is that I just wanted to, a simple question. Shall we leave Euro or shall we stay in Europe?
I think we should stay.
You
see, I'm for staying in, because I think Europe, despite all its faults, can be made to be better if we put our heart and soul into it. And I'm making a speech this coming Monday in Brussels, which will be the first of hopefully a positive argument for staying in Europe. Ian, on the other hand, I think still sitting painfully in the fence as far as I can understand.
That's going to happen until June the 23rd.
Are you coming out on June the 23rd?
Well, maybe after, or maybe June
the day before.
Maybe June the 24th then.
We might have to wait to the day before the referendum, Amjad, to find out Ian Dale's train of thought on this matter.
Definitely the day after, you will.
But anyway, you'll find out on Monday, Amjad. I'm for staying.
Talking of referendums, or referenda, I'm never quite sure which it is. Nicola Sturgeon seems to have got herself in a bit of a pickle in the debates about whether there should be another referendum. She's been swinging all over the place on this issue.
I've seen all these debates.
She says that
head and shoulders above the rest.
Well, that may be, but she says she'll propose a second referendum when a range of polls indicate most Scots want a second vote on the Constitution. How does that fit in with what she, and indeed you, said in 2014 when you said you would respect the result of the 2014 referendum?
Well, no, she's making the point that there are two circumstances in which you would see another referendum on Scottish independence. The first would be if there was a change in material circumstances, and the one that's normally given is the question on Europe. If Scotland voted in, England voted out, Scotland was dragged out. And I think most people, certainly a range of political opinion, say that would be the provisions that would make another referendum inevitable. And secondly, the second argument Nicola's brought forward is, look, if there's a sustained evidence that a majority of people in Scotland wish to have another referendum, then it would be undemocratic to deny people in Scotland the right to have that. And that, I think, is a pretty strong argument in the sense it's founded on democracy. And she hasn't been at all tied in knots on this. This is what she's been saying. This is what she's been saying for some time.
Well, because they're not very reliable at the moment, are they?
Wasn't it? I'm trying to think. It was Ernest Bevan who said that, you know, if you try to think about an elephant in your living room, it's quite difficult to describe, but there's no doubt whatsoever when it comes through the door. I think a sustained demand is a bit like that.
But you as an SNP politician might see that. The UK government might not agree with that, because in the end, the referendum is in the gift of the UK government, isn't it?
Well, that's where I disagree with you, and having had some experience of being in that position, I mean, I was constantly told in the run-up to the 2011 election, and even in its aftermath by some people, that the UK government would never agree to that. But once you have that sustained opinion in Scotland, once you have a vote of the Scottish Parliament, both of which you would have to have, then no UK Prime Minister is going to gainsay it, not in an age of democracy.
What would happen, though, if the UK Prime Minister did say, well, sorry, the 2014 vote, that was it, the SNP acknowledged that at the time, would you then expect Nicola Sturgeon to go ahead with a referendum anyway?
No, that won't happen, Ian.
Well, in the circumstance that it
any
did.
UK Prime Minister will concede and bow to the will and wishes of the Scottish Parliament, because the Scottish people are
Really?
sovereign. Yes. And that's what we tested.
Have
and that's
you had
what was
that conversation
demonstrated.
with Boris Johnson?
Well, I mean, I have had a number of conversations with Boris Johnson. One or two of them have been reasonably lucid. But, you know, who knows that Boris, as he used to say, who wanted, if not to abolish the Scottish Parliament, then to severely restrict its powers, if I remember him correctly. I mean, that might well be a change in material circumstances. Who knows?
I mean, get your Mystic Meg sort of glass out. Do you think that there will be a referendum within the next 5 years?
I think a lot depends on the European referendum, but I noticed that Nicola said that she expected to see another referendum within her term as the First Minister of Scotland. And so I rest on the advice of Nicola Sturgeon.
We know what you want to do if we leave the EU, but in the circumstance that we remain...
Well, I was just saying that Nicola said she expected to see another referendum in her period as First Minister of Scotland, which, as we all know, is going to extend for some considerable time. But nonetheless, I rest on the advice of my leader.
Why is it that after... I mean, I think this is one of the big issues in the Scottish Parliament elections at the moment. Why is it that still, after 9 years of SNP government... If you're in the richest 20% of people in Scotland, you're 3.5 times more likely to go to university than in the rest of the UK, where it's 2.5.
Yeah, but the difficulty with that, stating it that way, is more people in Scotland go into higher education as a total. So, although you're quite right, the ratio of people from the most deprived communities has been disappointing. The actual total...
But worse than the rest of the UK?
No. I'm pointing out we have 50% of people, youngsters in Scotland, go into higher education, much higher than the UK as a whole. So the numbers...
Well, it's not much. It's about 44% in England, so it's not much.
Well, yeah, but you're dealing with small percentage of what you just said.
Yeah, but this is 30% worse in Scotland than in England or Wales or Northern Ireland.
The total of people from deprived communities going to university in Scotland has been rising. It just hasn't been rising as fast as we would like. In order to change and address that, the government in Scotland has put through legislation to effectively make sure that the universities respond to the wish to see a more even social and economic distribution of people at university. Now, some of the universities don't like that very much, but I think most people in Scotland say, look, we have to make sure this happens. But
you look at that, and people from the outside will think, well, this is further evidence that the SNP is actually going after a middle-class vote, because these are middle-class students that are generally going to university, a third more than in England.
Well, can I just point out that, let's take another statistic to see if we can match this up. 92% now of Scottish children are going on to positive destinations from school. Again, much higher than England or Wales. And positive destination means either university or college or into employment or an apprenticeship. So that figure, that 92%, which has been rising, I think, from 87% back in 2007, tells you that the youngsters in Scotland will still face many, many challenges, but circumstances, given the economic difficulties we've had, are actually looking much more promising.
Is part of the reason for that spending in schools under the SNP has actually fallen by 5% over 9 years?
Well, I mean, you argue the figure, but spending it per pupil in Scotland is much higher than it is in England.
It's fallen. In England it's rising. In Scotland it's falling. Because you put all the money into the university students.
Not at all. The spending per pupil in Scotland is higher. And remember, unlike England, we have virtually all of our children in the state sector in Scotland. There isn't lots and lots of people who are not within the state education sector. So the fact that spending per pupil is higher indicates the priority that's given to education in Scotland.
The reason I raise that is because it seems to me that the Conservatives are on the rise in Scotland, which is a sentence I never thought I'd hear myself say. Labour are in the doldrums.
The rise of Scotland is the radical independence.
You are now having to target Conservative voters to vote SNP. Are they the main threat to you now?
Absolutely nonsense. Look, the SNP are about 50% of the vote. Now, any party in England who ever aspired to... I mean, I think Cameron was elected in, 36% of the vote? The SNP are running about 50% of the vote. That's an extraordinary...
it is an extraordinary achievement, and you're likely to get...
That doesn't leave all that much for the rest. And when you say the Conservatives on the rise, actually what's happening is that Labour are falling so fast, they are catching up with the Conservatives' low ratings.
But the Conservatives now, do you think they are going to be the main opposition to you in the Scottish Parliament after Thursday?
If you want to guess, I think Labour will hold on to second. But actually, Nicola and her team have been spending most of their election concentrating on who's going to come first, not who's going to come second.
Well, Alex, we hope to talk to you on Friday on the programme, we can analyse the results. And thank you very much indeed.
Did you actually mean to say you were going to come out one side or the other the day before the Euro referendum?
No, the day after. The referendum is on June the 23rd.
Oh, you're coming out after the referendum. Well, that's so brave and courageous.
I think my producer might have something to say if I came out really beforehand. Indeed. Well, I'm a broadcaster. You're a politician. Now, as I said, people in Scotland as well as in other parts of the UK will go to the polls tomorrow. We'll be hearing from the other main parties in the Scottish parliamentary elections a little later in today's show. Coming up after the news and travel, we're going to be talking about Syrian child refugees. David Cameron seems to be making a U-turn on accepting more. Is he right to do so? The lines are open now, 0345 6060 973. I'm Ian Dale, this is LBC. 25 to 5 is the time. Ros Unwin has the news headlines.
The Prime Minister is signalling the government